Welcome to Behind the Sims. At SaberSim, we're a team of professional gamblers, data scientists, and sports nerds building the best DFS optimizer and sports betting model on the market. This podcast is a behind-the-scenes look at how we do it. Every episode is an unedited recording of our team's actual conversations as we research, analyze, and iterate our way to answering the tough questions in DFS and sports betting. Whether we're answering questions like what's the best way to build your bankroll, analyzing different ways to diversify, or even building new models, we're going to share it all right here and we aren't holding anything back. If you're ready to go deep into what it really takes to win, then this is a podcast for you. All right, so I know Jordan and I are pretty excited to dig back into the contest analysis work you've been doing, Eric. Last time we synced up, it was kind of just trying to get like, I'm curious to hear how you phrase it. Can you say just like what the work has been, what work has been done since we last chatted?
Yeah, so I guess with our last chat, I feel like we were trying to get pretty granular in like this contest versus this contest, but I feel like we didn't have a good way of measuring, like an output to sort of point to say that contest B is better than contest A, and so the road that I feel like we've kind of been going the whole time, but eventually just kind of got to, is actually simming a contest and checking the ROIs for each lineup in the contest. And so with that, I guess the general idea is basically if you can sim a contest, you can test the lineups.
To make sure like I'm just thinking about it the right way, can you describe what simming the contest actually means?
Yep. Yeah. So for the way that we sort of landed on doing this, we're taking an actual contest, so the actual lineups in the contest, we keep those like the same. So we're not generating lineups for a contest or doing anything like that. It's like, if Giant Squid played this lineup in this contest, like that's the lineup that we're simulating. And so with those real lineups, we're assigning them a fantasy point score based on our simulations.
What does that look like? Because I'm assuming you're not just giving them, hey, this is the average across the simulations. Like, what are you doing there?
Yeah, no. So for like an individual, I guess in an individual lineup, we have our 10 players. In an individual sim, each of those players has their fantasy point value. So, Bryce Harper scored 14 in sim 1 and he scored 0 in sim 2. And so for the lineup, we're just summing up for sim 1, the lineup score could be 100. For sim 2, the lineup score could be 3 or like something like that. And so then, we have, for that lineup, we basically have its fantasy points scored, but like in the simulation.
And then you're saying, okay, in this simulation, these are the points, and then this is what they would have gotten paid?
Yeah. So once we have, it's easiest just to kind of think about a single sim first. So in like sim 1, we score all of the lineups. So lineup 1, 100 fantasy points, lineup 2, 50. Then from that, we rank the lineups. So, first place, second place, third place, just like the contest would be. And then from those ranks, we get the payouts. So then the lineup in sim 1 would be like, it made 50K or it lost $15 or like whatever. And then when you do that 2,500 times or, however many times, you get an expected return on investment.
Okay.
So that
you're basically saying, say you do it 100 times, you're adding up all the winnings, subtracting entry fees, and then dividing by 100 to get like the expected value for an average contest.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So that's like, for one contest, that's sort of how that takes place. When you throw another contest in, like obviously you can do the same thing. But to get to the answer of like, if you took a lineup from contest A and put it into contest B, you have to, I mean, obviously what we decided on doing is putting an individual lineup like one by one into that new contest, and then going through the process of, okay, now we're, checking how many fantasy points it scored in this sim, like ranking it and then scoring it.
Can you explain that a little bit more? I guess I'm trying to figure out how to, the comparative side of it.
Yep. So I guess the best way to think about it is like when we first sim contest A, we get an expected ROI for the first lineup in it. So that might be, 20%. Like
first meaning
just like first in the list.
Literally like the CSV we get for the contest, just whatever is top.
Yeah, whatever's at the top. And I mean, I think
Okay.
it's usually alphabetical by entry name, but like whatever's at the top.
Okay.
So that's kind of like the base assumption is that lineup in that contest is a 20% ROI. So then what we do is we take that lineup, we put it in a different contest, we sim that contest, and then we check the ROI for that lineup. And then you can compare the expected ROI in the original contest and then the new contest.
Okay.
So one thing that immediately kind of sounds interesting to me there is that there is a different strategic approach that players would take to play these different contests. Like, I think we should be aware that the difference between the ROI of a same lineup in two different contests is not entirely going to be just because of the difference of those contests, right?
Right. I mean, that's also where the work of picking the contest pairs comes in, is that you minimize. Ideally, we're trying to find contests that should have similar strategies. Whereas, I guess, it does get challenging when you look at the single. Like, basically, entry fee should be irrelevant for the strategy of the way you're building your lineups. It's going to be around, and I guess even entry limit. That has some impact, but also just like the number of entrants and how top heavy it is going to be probably the biggest impact. It's like we'll just have to keep that in mind. But I think
I have like thought of that, Jordan, and I do think that that's an important, like, if you're building for the $5 single entry versus if you're building for the $5 150 max, like I do think that people are building differently. And so in our results, obviously, if we're taking real lineups and just moving them over, that's not necessarily how, people are actually building.
Yeah.
But like the way that you could try to fix that would be to generate lineups and like not use real lineups for a contest. But I think that just causes a big headache in terms of then you're making assumptions about like what your lineup should look like for a certain contest, and all of that stuff, I guess. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but I think like in general, it makes more sense to use the real lineups versus you're just adding more complexity and more, I don't know, just more difficulty, and you're adding more assumptions if you're building lineups, kind of thing.
How difficult would it be to generate like new lineups? Because I guess I know you just touched on this, but it's like, if you are going to build lineups in different ways for different kind of contests. Like you're going to put in a different sort of lineup in a massive double up versus the Millie Maker, as extreme examples. But we're not trying to control for that almost. I mean, it's more because when we're actually building lineups, like we can make the choice to put in different lineups. And so, yeah, I think it would be building, say, a set of 20 lineups for this 20 max, a set of whatever, because you're comparing. It's not as though you build your lineups first and then only those are the only lineups you can put in the contest. So you do have, I guess what I'm getting at is you do have that agency over where the lineups are going. You can just say, okay, this doesn't make sense to put in that contest, so I'm going to build a different lineup. And because ultimately what you're trying to figure out is what are the contests I can play that will give me the highest ROI. So yeah, by building the actual lineups, you're just saying, okay, say I build the best single entry style lineup. What is my ROI there versus in this other contest? So I mean, like, what would that technically look like?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be all that difficult. I would worry a little bit, and I think this is another thing, I guess, that we can discuss is because we're using the results of our sims, like in theory, our expected ROIs are biased towards what we think is right versus like something actually. So my only worry with building lineups is like how you're building them, and how we're like scoring the lineups are almost like correlated there. That
makes a lot more sense to me now because, right, when it's impossible to sim a contest without having a large data set of projections you can use, ideally from sims. And so it's like if you were to look at EV built with SaberSim, like the lineups built with SaberSim, they would be higher because we're like grading it against our own inputs. And so, yeah, using the real lineups makes sense because we're not going to have that same bias. We will probably inflate, well, not probably, we will inflate the ROIs of people who use SaberSim that we aren't aware of or just agree most closely with us, but it's unavoidable there. So that makes sense. And then, like, the farther down that rabbit hole we go, the more noise that gets introduced and the worse it is. So, okay. No, I'm feeling good about that.
Yeah. So just to kind of, I guess, to add on to that, like the fix for not using our sims for trying to sort of get rid of that bias would be to use actual scores. But then you're back at a sample size issue where it's like, you have one actual score for this lineup when you put it in the other contest versus 3,000 scores for this lineup when you put it in contest. So it's a little bit of a balancing act there.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So yeah, that's helpful for me to wrap my head around the methodology of where we're at. Like, what, I guess, have you found?
Yeah, so the findings have been pretty cool. I mean, again, I basically this morning just kind of got it so that it could really push through a lot of the contests. Whereas like to start, I mean, I guess it's just kind of like the process where you start by basically being able to sim one contest and then two, and then now it's like, okay, let's, be able to feed 40 in there and spit out ROIs. So like I'm still sort of working through that. This morning for the most part got that done. But I've done, a couple of contests that I think have been pretty interesting. So one of them was the chin music and the knuckleball, which, just to refresh, is the $5 single entry versus the $5, usually 150 max, sometimes it's a little bit less, but like a low multi-entry versus a high multi-entry at the same price point, pretty similar entrance. And with that, what I found was the average ROI for a single entry lineup put into the 150 max went down about 8%, which is a lot.
So what was the ROI of that line? Like say in the, you're just saying, okay, I get it. You're saying
This of every lineup.
yeah, right. Okay.
You pick, you could average and median, we're pretty close, but your average lineup from the single entry into the knuckleball, the ROI went down about 8%.
Wow.
Which I think is interesting. I mean, so that for that one, I believe it was like 4 contests worth kind of thing. So it's still like 4 contests isn't a ton. I mean, you have to remember that it's the 4 contests on top of usually it's like 3,000 sims of each contest. So, you are
Why
getting
was it only
a sample
4?
size.
Just saying time to run it.
Time to run it.
Okay.
Basically, I was able to finish that yesterday, and then this morning, finally got it where it's like we can do a lot more now with that.
And is it something where you can set it up as a batch process where you kick it off tonight and then come back to it Monday? Okay.
Yeah. It was, I don't know, it's a little bit mathy, but like before we basically were scoring, like we were putting a lineup in and scoring it and ranking it, and then like recording that and then putting a new lineup in, versus the new way is basically you put all the lineups in and you do some like fancy rank stuff and it spits it out exactly the same as the other stuff, but you only really are ranking twice, which is a huge time save.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So still like early stuff, but so I felt like it was an interesting result. It kind of confirmed more what I would have thought, like the 150s being sharper than the single entries. But again, it is a little bit tricky because you still do have that, like the people building for single entry, like that lineup isn't built for the 150 max.
Is it worth doing the opposite and saying,
I was going to say that.
What is the ROI of a 150 max lineup being put into the single entry?
Yeah, I could do that.
Because it almost seems like that we could average it together. And that almost, because we're saying, yes, a single entry type lineup, and as an aside, and I know Jordan's talked about this in office hours and stuff, I think people will probably put way too of cashy lineups in a single entry than they really should. Like, it shouldn't change. That factor alone shouldn't have a massive impact on how you're building. But regardless, if you were to say, okay, here's how a single entry lineup would perform in the 150 max, here's how 150 max would perform in the single entry, and then average those, it seems like that would help balance it out a little bit. And if they were opposites, where it was like, that would show, okay, like there's probably,
I think they should be like pretty close to opposite. Like if we're at negative 8% going from one way, I think
sorry. What I mean is that when I say opposite, I don't mean that like these lineups going to single entries would I would expect, yes, their ROI would increase, but by opposite I mean is like it wouldn't suggest that the other contest was softer. Like it wouldn't make us change our conclusion on it. Because, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if you're to take a cash lineup and put that into the flagship contest, one, I have no idea what that would look like as far as ROI. It would probably be, I guess that would just be interesting, but I could see that like if you take two contests where the lineup construction is genuinely very different, and that you could attribute the difference in our simmed ROI to the fact that it's just like not a good lineup for this other contest. That's where I'm saying is like that would be something we'd want to ignore. But in this comparison, I don't think that's the case because again, a single entry is really just with cash and in top heavy GPPs that I think it would get you bad data by looking at it both ways, or just anyway would be inaccurate. But
yeah, no,
does that at all make sense what I'm getting at?
I think I understand what you're saying now. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. I don't know, Jordan, do you have any
on that?
I was thinking, I don't think they'll be perfect. So if we're expecting an 8% drop in ROI from single entry to the 150 here, I actually don't think we'll probably get the exact opposite, meaning positive 8% ROI going the other way, because the lineup is getting compared to a different set of lineups taking it the other way. Like we're taking we're taking every single entry right now and saying, what if somebody played that in the 150 against all the lineups that are in the 150? This is going to be taking every lineup from the 150 and saying, what if you played that against every lineup in the single entry? Because those lineup buckets are different. I actually I think I'm expecting to probably see a little bit of a different number there.
I think it'll be different. I don't like, it's not just like, 8% one way is negative 8% the other way, but I feel like it should be somewhat close. So I think that'll be interesting too, to see just how close that is, I guess.
Is there any merit in assuming the entries are similar, the number of entries are similar? No, never mind. This is a dumb idea. I was going to think about like just taking like all the lineups and seeing what that would have done in the other one, but that doesn't make any sense because you are trying to compare it against the competition of that specific contest. Okay, so were there other interesting things that jumped out at you? I know you said there's more analysis you want to do.
Yes, I mean, just I guess another like one of the sort of examples that I did was the four-seamer to the 15. And like again, a pretty similar, that one, it was if you took a lineup
the
from
four-seamer is a 20 entry max with
usually it's like
60-ish%, but like they're both big. So like right today, there's 12,000 in the four-seamer, 17,000 in the flagship, and so I mean they're similar sized. Yeah.
So yeah, I took a few of those, and to put a lineup from the four-seamer into the relay throw, the average ROI went down about 6%. So again, like it's pretty solid start there, I think.
Are you? And you said we don't currently store the 50-cent Minimax.
Yeah, it's in there like 6 times or something.
Could you do those 6?
I think so, yeah.
Because that could be interesting, just saying that, seeing how that compares to the $1 one.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, we have 4 of those. It looks like. Yeah, I could run those. You'd want those compared to the $1?
I would want it the 50-cent Minimax compared to the $1 Minimax.
Okay, gotcha.
So the other things that I would look into would be comparing, because I know there's more you want to do, but like the examples you gave are around varying the entry limit. I would be curious to see when you keep that steady, how other factors change, whether it's buy-in being one, but the other being size of the pool, the number of entries, because we just need to look at it from all those angles to get a better picture, because frankly, like okay, this contest is 150 max. It has a lower ROI than the single entry, but like I can only play the single entry once. I can play this 150 times.
Right.
And I think that's something that we've got to wrap our heads around when figuring this out. Because those are like the actual decisions people are going to be making. And so we can pretty objectively say, if you're only playing one lineup and you don't view it as a lottery ticket, and you don't like, you're not just trying to get the highest potential payout, you want to actually have the highest ROI. Yeah, don't put that in a single entry contest. But that's just not the reality for most people. So I think looking at it by controlling the other variables would be good.
For sure. Yeah,
I
agree. One other thought
Yeah.
that I had, and this is getting a little bit away from like the analysis and more back into kind of where we started. Like this, again, just kind of an idea, but I think it could be interesting if we had these two contests and like they both had the same lineup in them. So we weren't like crossing them. We were basically just saying, okay, this lineup and this lineup are exactly the same.
Mhm.
When we sim the two contests, like what are the ROIs? I feel like it would be pretty similar to what we're doing, but then you're not crossing like someone physically played that lineup in the $5 single entry, and someone also like played that lineup in the 150 max. So like, you kind of are avoiding a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, would someone actually put this single entry lineup into the 150 max? I don't know the impact that would have on like sample size or
Right.
anything like that. But that
And
could
you
be
also
a
have a selection
possibility.
bias because
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be interesting. I don't think we need to go down that path now. Yeah. What are you thinking, Jordan?
I was thinking, if we run these sims on kind of some of the best contest pairs that we had identified last time or the time ago, these ROI numbers just are a lot easier to process and they make a lot more intuitive sense. I think we're getting actually pretty close here to quantifying and comparing the different factors against each other. There's obviously a sample size question throughout all of this, but like if we can find some compelling pairs that say, you have a 5% ROI drop when you jump from a single entry to a 150 max, but the jump from the $3 threshold of where Sharks can play represents a 10% ROI difference, controlling for the other factors. We're getting what feels like to me really close to giving someone a cheat sheet of prioritize this, then this, then this, and until you've filled up your allocation for the slate. So this seems like a really good direction to me.
One thing I'm wondering is if we hold entry limit the same, it doesn't feel as though we should be looking at individual lineup ROI.
You're
it feels
talking
like
about...
we should be looking at, say we look at a contest pair where they're both 3 entry max.
Okay.
I don't think, it goes back to what I was touching on, but I feel like it's clear in my head right now. I don't think we care how one lineup would perform in one versus the other, because generally speaking, if we're just playing one lineup, we're going to put that in the single entry. I think that's going to be, obviously we don't have enough data to like be 100% confident in that, but I think that's like a pretty safe assumption. And so what is going to better model reality is saying, if I put in 3 lineups in this one versus that, because that's really the decision you're making. You say, okay, I've filled up all the single entries. Now I got to start deciding between the next. And you could do it by the most honest way would probably be looking at people who actually like maxed it out, and taking those three and then comparing it to the other one. Because you're truly saying, hey, if I put these ones in this contest instead, how would I have done? And yeah, is that realistic as far as setting it up for that?
Yeah, I think it's feasible. Like, I mean, basically what you're saying is instead of like if in contest A we have 26 people who entered the like maximum amount of lineups, we only want to look at those like 26 people's lineups and put them into contest B and then simulate contest B. That's like essentially what you're saying. Because right now we're taking, yeah, sorry. So right now we take all of contest A's lineups and put them into contest B.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is only look at the maxers lineups and put them into contest B and then check the ROIs for those.
To clarify, I wouldn't ignore the others, but I would just do this in a way where we could segment it out.
Right.
So like I would still look at all the entries, all the lineups, but I would just make sure that like there's an easy way for us to say, okay, here is all of it, and then here are the maxers as like a separate data point.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's very doable.
Okay. And then I'm wondering, because one of the other things I mentioned was like going bi-directionally and just saying, okay, going from this contest to that, but what about other way around?
Mm-hmm.
If we're not holding entry limit the same, what do you think we could do there? Like what makes sense?
I mean, like I would say the advantage of doing it this way is you're hopefully like, you know, obviously you're not controlling for certain factors and like isolating like, okay, here's the impact of like entry fee. It's more like we can directly compare the contests. Like, yeah, the contest as a whole versus like just focusing on isolating one variable. So like,
I guess to be clear, I'm not trying to, with this, I'm not trying to isolate a variable. What I'm trying to do is represent the actual decisions people are making when they're putting their lineups in, like choosing what to play.
Right.
Because it's not like I'm going to say, I think, yeah, it makes sense if the entry limits are the same to compare putting 20 in a 120 max and 20 in the other one. But what if it's between a 20 max and a 150 max? Like, it doesn't make sense. I probably wouldn't put 20 in the 150 max. Maybe that's dumb. Maybe I should, but that's what I'm getting at is I think realistically, there are other practical considerations there that I want to make sure we're thinking about and aren't getting too theoretical in a way that doesn't apply to how people actually follow this or could follow this.
The practical component is kind of interesting there too, because I wonder, like, are people entering more with a number of lineups that they intend to play, or is it more about they have a bankroll allocation that they're willing to spend? Like, I think that does kind of make sense if we're saying, like, you know, the average person says, I want to play 20 lineups and I'm deciding if I should play it in this contest or that. But I think it's probably more, I mean, if we could prove, for example, that it was overwhelmingly more profitable for somebody to play one $200 single entry than to spread that out all over the place. If that was me, I would just eat the additional variance that comes with it and play that one single lineup.
I mean, that's almost like, I would say that's almost definitely the case. Like maybe not 200, but like there's going to be a price point where putting it in one single entry will absolutely have a higher ROI than spreading it across a bunch of other contests. Like I think that's going to be inarguable.
Yeah.
And
No,
so the question is like, what is that variance? Would you really make that trade? Because I think like it's a thing that we probably will find.
Yeah.
And so that's a question of, do you maximize ROI at all costs? And it is something I want to touch on. But before we get into that, I mean, we do want to be aware of what people are doing, but I think this is ultimately what you were also getting at, is we should be more looking at this objectively so we can come up with the best practice of what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that is it probably would make sense to look at putting 20 entries in a contest that's not 20, that's more than 20 max, because it's worth seeing if that's an option. And like for the bankroll side of it, I mean, I think if people are saying, I want to build X number of lineups, I'm going to figure out what to put that in, that's probably bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it can still be profitable, but that's just, I think, relatively far away from optimal. And so we can sort of rule that one out. And it's more saying, okay, I have a certain amount of dollars that I'm going to wager. What are the best contests for me to put that in? I think, and I know you mentioned that, like, that's the question we ultimately are trying to answer. And so we should be taking that perspective as we evaluate this. Like, do we think what we're doing right now will give us an answer to that? And I'm not positive it will, because of like these other questions. Like, okay, like, sure, single entries are great, but like, is the one, like, should I really put one lineup in $100 single entry versus 20 in a, or 25, or no, sorry, we'll just do easy math. So 20 in a $5 20 max. Like, is that really going to be better? By a pure ROI standpoint? What about with variance? So I don't know, Eric, do you have any thoughts on just, if that's the question we're trying to answer, how we could, if you feel like we'll be able to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, I guess to start, I think that it makes sense to try and answer that question. Like, I think the way that people are like loading up DraftKings and it's like, okay, I have $100 for tonight. Like, give me this like $12, give me this, this, and then at the end it's like, okay, I have 20 entries total. I'm gonna build 20 lineups. Like, I think that that's definitely the flow that most people work in, and I think that, you know, we should kind of keep that in mind versus going entries first and then kind of over to dollars. But I think for sure that this, you know, it, to me, like, getting expected ROIs, I think it does answer which contest you should play. It doesn't answer, like, in terms of like risk tolerance or risk, I guess, like preference, even what you should play in terms of, okay, if you played your $5 20 max versus the single entry $100, like, you know, some people might like one or the other better. But I think, like, for us, yeah, it's, I guess it just is a question of like maximizing EV, I think, and then for the user or for the player, it's more of like, what are my preferences there? And I don't think we're ever going to be able to jump completely to like, here are the best contests no matter what, because we're always going to have some
Right.
sort of user preference.
But I think just tossing
like
out the
that.
risk management side, because I think that's a separate discussion. What about saying, Yeah, I think it's finding contests where a contest pair, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it's like where a single entry or 3 max, where the total buy-ins, if you max it out, if you max out both contests in the pair, the total buy-ins is roughly the same. And then saying which one has a higher overall return. Like that, because that's a valid, that's a realistic question that people likely already have. And I just think objectively, as far as bankroll management goes, like that's a smarter way of thinking about it. And if we can help inform that question, that seems like it would be valuable. So I guess it would be also comparing, comparing
That's
contest
interesting.
pairs,
And that is
comparing the overall ROI.
I do think
What were you gonna say,
that
Jordan?
gets us a lot closer to, I guess, our like original question of I have $80.
yeah.
Which contest should I enter? Kind of thing. So yeah, I like that.
That does get asked often too, and there are a lot of pairs like that. I know our sample size isn't great for the 50-cent mini max, but that's $75 to max, and the $4 20 max is $80. Very
a good
commonly
example.
asked in office hours is, should I go 150 in the mini or max the $4? At the very low stakes, another one that gets asked often is, should I play the quarter jukebox or should I just throw one lineup in the $5 single entry? I could probably come up with more there too.
Yeah. And I guess the way I would handle that, Eric, is for the mini max, it would be choosing 20, a set of 20 of those to put in the 4-seamer.
Right.
Because like you can't obviously put in all 150. So say, okay, what is the expected return of 20 lineups in the 4-seamer versus 150 in the mini max?
Gotcha.
And I guess you could like slightly control, like if it's dollars off, you could then just say like adjust for that to just get it. So that's more 1-to-1. But I think that will be interesting. And I guess to be clear, there's a lot of things that could be interesting to look into. We do want to make sure that we're not dragging this on too long. But
Yep.
I am also, I guess, sunk cost fallacy be damned. Like, I want to make sure that with the effort we've put in here, we're able to get something that's that really valuable. And if it's like a little bit extra work can get us something that's much more valuable, we want to take those extra steps. The last thing I want to touch on is that element of risk, of sort of steadier profits versus risk, or like higher risk but higher ROI. What are your thoughts, Eric, on how to measure that?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. I think the main driver. Sorry, go ahead.
Can we just use Kelly to calculate this?
Because
you can basically, I guess it's not because it's not like a
the payout structure.
It's not a binary
really
outcome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess to me that like question is based around the number of entrants and then how top heavy a contest is. So I think, like, I mean, obviously the more top heavy and the more entrants, it's just going to take longer and longer and longer to realize your EV.
Assuming your ROI holds steady.
Yeah. Which, is, I don't know, it's a little bit tricky to answer because, like, yeah, if you have a longer like time horizon, it can make sense to play some of those contests, but also, like, if you're never realizing EV, like, what are we doing? So So yeah, I mean it's tricky, and I think that especially is pretty like preference dependent.
I guess
Uh,
what I don't disagree. However, I don't think the preferences are informed, and that's more
okay.
what I'm getting at. Is I don't think you're wrong that it's primarily a function of the number of entries and how top heavy the payout structure is. Like, yes, that's definitely going to be correct. But how much of an impact does that make? What are realistic swings that could be seen there? I think that's more what I'm getting at is no, I think we can give good rules of thumb, but it's like Jordan was just saying, he thinks that the variance of the single entry is worth it if it's going to be a higher ROI than spreading that across a bunch of lineups. But I don't know. We don't know what that variance is, and so that's more my question. Is not what direction will it point us? It's more like what will it actually say? How big are these swings? That's really the other component.
Yeah, I don't have this idea totally fleshed out in my head, but I wonder if there's a way that we could like kind of sim it, but also have like a chronological component to it where we're like actually tracking a bankroll through the sims and saying like, yeah, in this contest you have a 10% ROI, but your swings look like this. Like this is what you should be prepared to experience. In this one, you only have a 5% ROI, but you have swings that look like this.
I mean, you should be able to just measure standard deviation when you're simming out a contest 3,000 times. Just say, what is the standard deviation? Is not going to be perfect, and maybe it's not even the best. But
I've done.
You think that tracking
stuff.
a bankroll makes sense to me?
Yeah, I've done some stuff like similar to what Jordan was talking about, where it's like, if with this payout contest, usually you're holding your ROI constant, which maybe we don't want to do, but how low are the lows and how high are the highs? And then like at the end of a season, what's the probability that you're either positive or negative? Like something like that, I think.
Why would we need to mess around with assuming any ROI, let alone like assuming one that stays constant versus just using the actual like contest sims? Because rather than saying how are you going to do over a season, we can just say if you played this contest on this day 3,000 times, here's how you would do across them all. And like I get that the total we're coming to is the aggregate amount of all that, but if it was literally from one day to the next, how often would you go broke at a different bankroll? What are the highs and lows over different samples within that? So I guess that's more, I think what you're getting at, Jordan, is just saying using the sim data as like the actual, rather than doing more of a math equation. It's just using literally what happened when we sim out the contest. Yeah, is that?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Does that at least make sense, Eric, of what I'm?
Yeah, just like my worry with doing it that way is I think you're making assumptions on like what lineups are played.
Well, don't we know the lineups that were played?
Well, but like I guess we could measure like an individual's ROI in our like database.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is you would look at the Minimax and say, okay, let's group everyone by their username, and then say when we sim this out 3,000 times, pretend that those are 3,000 dependent events in the sense of like they're sequential events. Where it's like, okay, we do this first one, here's how much money we started with, here's where we're at now. We do the next one, and we just go through that, and then from that we could say, here's how much of a bankroll you need to have to get your risk of ruin below X. Here are realistic swings for, and it's like, rather than saying for the average 5% ROI players, like who the fuck knows what that is? But we have a simulated ROI. So we can say for this person who was simulated out in this contest at this exact percent, here are what their swings look like. Yeah.
So like, I mean, I like have that in some of the like initial stuff that I did. I would say that the issue with that is like, so in this $5 chin music, there's someone who their expected ROI was negative 99%.
It might have been just me when I forgot to put lineups in.
And so like, you know, if like the lineups are still impacting how big the swings are, I guess. Like if you assume an ROI, I guess, yeah, you hold that constant versus like if, you know, in some of these contests, if people are playing like horribly, that's going to impact how deeply they swing, I guess. Like,
right. But like, I don't really care about creating a guide for Megafish to figure out what their swings are. And I don't think they care about that. So it's like, yeah, there's going to be weird shit in there. Like I think it was actually the last time we recorded this, I registered at the start of like 5 minutes before we started talking, and they just forgot to put in any lineups. And so yeah, like I'm gonna look really bad. But that's okay. And so I think it's, yes, like there's gonna be weird stuff, but that's because there is weird stuff in contests, and those aren't the people we're gonna look at to give suggestions to. Like we're not gonna say if you have a negative 99.9% ROI, here's your bankroll rules. It's like, yeah, don't play. Does that
yeah, I like I'm
sense?
still struggling a little bit with like turning the, you know, the dollar amount that they won or lost in the 3,000 sims of the contest we did into like something, I guess, like bigger than what it is. Like if someone has, you know, a 20% ROI in this contest across our 3,000 sims, like I guess what we're looking for there is like where, like when they were getting to that ROI, like how low are they dropping and how high are they rising to, which then I feel
and
like,
do they ever go broke at like,
Okay.
and so what I'm saying is we should have a way where it's very easy. You set a bankroll at the start, make it so that like the total, do it just 20 times the cost of maxing out the contest, and that's obviously low, but just set it there, and then you're just tracking that. You're saying, okay, for this 150 max, mini max, it's $150 to max it out. Then they're going to start with a $3,000 bankroll. We run the sim once. They lost 70%. Okay, so that's minus whatever 70% of 150 is. And then that's their bankroll for day 2, which is really just the second run through of the sims. And then you're seeing, yeah,
what I can't match up with that, I guess, is like if you aren't, like I think implicitly, no matter what, you're almost assuming an ROI. Because like even if we're just picking a regular player, like if, you know, if we go into our contest and we say, okay, our player is going to be Giant Squid, and we only look at his lineups, like we're still, you know, as we sim through, we're
I'm saying we would just look at like a lot of players.
Okay.
I get what you're saying though. Like it's if we just pick an arbitrary player or a set of a lot of different players that are all profitable or something like that, it's not a huge difference than if we had just assumed generic player with 10% ROI.
I don't think we can say that. It's not a huge difference. We don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is what I'm suggesting like very difficult to do?
No, it's not difficult. I just don't know what it like 100% gains us over either an assumption or yeah.
Can you explain how the like assumed 5% ROI would work?
Yep. So like with an assumed 5% ROI, I mean obviously that's going to be split into like, they get first place X amount of time and they get second place
And
X
how is
amount
that
of time.
determined?
So when I simmed it, what I did is I took my actual results for like, okay, I put 1.5% of my entries into the top 1%. I put 1.4 into this. And then from there, what I did is it would choose a percentile that my lineup went into. So there's a 1.5% chance that it goes into the top 1%. And then from there, once it's
And it does that no matter what you assumed the ROI was going to be?
well, the ROI is sort of baked into like the how often you put a lineup into whatever percentile.
Right.
So I mean that can look different.
But I guess that's what I'm saying is I just feel like there's a ton of assumptions. You could say you could simulate out your variance, but why would you simulate it out when you just have all of your results and can measure the variance? And so it's saying, okay, here's my ROI. Here is how often I came in the top 1%. I'll assign those and then sim it out from there. But like, you have the underlying data. Like you don't need to simulate anything when you have the pure results, unless you're saying you don't think you have a good enough sample for it and you're trying to expand the sample size. I don't see why you would want to use a sim instead
I would
of
say
that. And I
yeah.
also don't understand how you would scale that to a different ROI.
Right. So like I would say what that would be useful for is like if you're like, okay, I'm down 10K this season, but I'm putting 1.6% of my entries into the top 1%. If I sim the start of the season like that, like is that result, like where is that result sort of along my range of outcomes? It's like, is that a bottom 90th percentile? Is that, a bottom 50th? And should I make adjustments to how I'm playing based on that?
Yeah, I guess it's valuable. The smaller the sample size and the more the variance, the more valuable that is because you don't have the big enough sample for it. What I'm getting at is we are already simulating these contests out 3,000 times. So we have the sample size, we have the actual lineups. To divorce it from that and bake in all these other assumptions seems worse. So I guess if when it comes down to what do we gain from this, is that we rely on the actual data as much as possible, and don't have to try to scale. Okay, like we don't have to figure out, oh, this person at this ROI gets there at this percent, because it's like no, like we just literally look at the sims and see what they did. That's, and I don't know if I'm explaining this wrong or I'm not personally getting anything, but does that seem helpful or valuable?
I mean, I think at the end of sort of both ways that we're thinking about doing this, I think we're going to arrive at a very similar number in terms of like, how like the swings and everything, because I guess implicitly, if we're looking at a certain player, they have like an expected ROI. And so, for that, like if we're looking at Giant Squid, we're gonna see at the end his
I don't like
ROI.
this. the more the more you're talking about it, the less I like it,
Okay.
because there's just way too much baked in to these assumptions. Because one, we're starting sort of with the conclusion. We're saying, here is my expected ROI, but based on what? Like based on that's what it is so far. But we're also saying I don't have a big enough sample size to be able to measure the variance. So why is the sample good enough to know your ROI, but not enough to just measure the variance over that same sample? Because I would guess you would see the effects of variance faster than you would stabilize an ROI, or at least like the magnitude.
Yeah.
Secondly, and this is probably more important, ROIs are not going to be like the entire purpose of that. We're like the reason why we're doing all this analysis is because no one is a 5% ROI player. They have X% ROI in this contest and Y% in that, and it blends together to this. But what we're trying to do with this project is not look at a blended number. We're trying to say we're literally trying to evaluate different contests versus each other because we believe ROIs are not held constant across them. And by simming out an individual contest based on the actual lineups in it and not having to make any assumptions about ROI, just literally using the lineups that are there, I feel like that removes so much chance for noise and just other things that it just kind of goes really down to what we're trying to do here. And I feel like for the method that you're talking about to be better, it's calling into question like all the work we're doing right now.
Like I somewhat agree, because I mean obviously we wouldn't be like using the actual lineups in the the actual lineups and the actual sims. But I still think that at the end of it, no matter
it might just not matter
which way we do it, it won't matter.
Okay. How much extra? Yeah, and like that's often going to be the case. And if that is, so be it. I guess how much extra work would it be to do my method versus what you're talking about?
It's not that much extra work, because like really what you're saying is just track by sim, for like an entry, like for a player's entries.
For a player's entries, exactly.
It's not that much extra work. So
okay, and I guess when it comes to the ROIs being different by contest, with your method, we account for that because, like, in the sense that we could just we're evaluating one contest at a time, and so we could just use different assumed ROIs, but and base those on the work that you've done up until this point. So I think it's okay, but if it's not that much extra work, I would still like to do this because I feel like it leaves up as little to chance or as little to variables we're not considering, or just it removes as many assumptions as we can. And yeah, I might be wasting your time, but as long as it's not a ton of time, I'm okay with that risk. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. So what were you gonna say? Sorry.
No, nothing more. I feel like I could try and explain my spot one more time, but I don't think that we're getting anywhere. So it's fine.
No, and like this is where, yeah, I think I'm more thinking about it from a theoretical standpoint, and just being like, why use these assumptions when we don't have to? And it's not to say there's no assumptions in Simulant the Contest, but I think they're different. And I'm more thinking from like that perspective, where I feel like you're thinking about it from a more practical perspective. Yeah, that just doesn't matter because like these assumptions aren't bad and it's going to get close enough. And so I think, yeah, like you very well could be right. And I would almost assume you are, but there's a chance that you're wrong. And this, like, I don't think my approach is going to produce bad data.
I agree.
And so that's one of the risks, is that if we are trying to take this research and present somewhat conclusive findings from it, the idea that that's really what I'm coming down to, is that especially when it's the way people are risking their money, even if it's a small chance of just having completely fucked data, I don't want to take that chance if there's a way that's not wildly more complicated to minimize some of those risks. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. But you are very likely right that it most likely doesn't matter, but I just don't want to gamble on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this, like, the way that you're describing, I think that it falls closer in line to what we're doing before. And so I think it, like,
Yeah.
with just the contest stuff. So I think that keeping that constant, I think, makes a lot of sense. So
Cool. All right. So to summarize, definitely making progress and feel like we're close. And the last things to do are comparing bidirectionally. As far as specifics go, we want to compare the 50-cent Minimax to the $1 Minimax. But bigger picture, we'd like to find ways to compare the overall return of a set of lineups in contests with different entry limits, but we're maxing out both costs approximately the same. And also it's making sure to evaluate pairs that have the same entry limit, just to get a better idea of the impact of those other factors. And then the universally agreed upon best way of doing it, of using the actual contest data and simulating it out to measure the potential swings there.
sounds
Make
good.
sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, sorry, this project is kind of ballooned massively, but I mean, how are you feeling? Like, are you just hating me right now, or is it at least like been interesting?
No, like, I mean, it was like a pretty solid undertaking to
Yeah.
be able to sim out a contest in like 3 days or whatever. But honestly, like, it was a lot of fun. And, I was talking with Will and Matt, and like, I'd run into a roadblock and be like, hey, I can't figure this out. And, we'd kind of put our heads together for 5 minutes and sort of move forward on it. So like, it's been a lot of fun, and I think the results are really cool. Like, when I initially got the contest sim sort of up, I spent like half an hour just simming random contests and looking at who had the highest expected ROIs in it. So like, yeah, I don't know. It's a really cool project, I think.
Yeah. And I am very interested in seeing what some of these swings look like, because it'll be cool to be like, look, this person has the highest ROI in this contest, but they're still going to have, I don't know, like whatever the swings are, or maybe it's like, no, like their swings aren't that bad, or maybe there's some. Yeah, so I guess the last thing I would say is try to measure the swings of as many players as you can. We don't care about the obvious losing players. But like, what I think would be really cool to find would be, there's very likely to be, and this, we aren't going to just go forever on this analysis, but I think for a separate project, it could be a good follow-up. Is basically what we're trying to say is, first, what are the best contests by a pure ROI standpoint? Then, how should I evaluate where to put my money based on the level of risk that I'm comfortable with, that my bankroll will allow? But there is the third degree of that, which is saying, how can I, within a contest, structure my lineups in a way that lowers ROI, but also lowers variance? Because I'm assuming we're going to find it's not as though every 5% player has the same variance, but I think you're going to find some people who have good ROIs, but not necessarily the best, but have like very low in air quotes, like very low variance compared to people at the top. And that's something to think about more. So yeah. Awesome, guys. Appreciate it. Have a good weekend. And yeah, we'll chat next week and hopefully put a bow on this and then can get you on office hours to share the findings.
Sounds good.
Sweet.
Awesome. See you guys.
Yep.